money to begin your emergency kits and your organizations. So at this point, I guess we're ready to move on. Let's see, I think, let's see, I think I lost control there. Okay, at this point, I'm going to pass it on to Dave Christensen. He's one of our executive committee members, and he's going to be taking it from there. And then I'm going to just ask our team to just pass on to the next person according to our agenda. So Dave Christensen, may I ask you to go ahead and start?
Sure, thank you, Tom. Most of you on the call are familiar with what VOAD is. It's voluntary organizations coordinating with each other in disasters. And it's actually last year during COVID celebrated its 50th anniversary. It formed in the wake of Hurricane Camille down on the Gulf Coast, and the realization that there are a lot of not-for-profit, public-private volunteer agencies that were trying to help, but there wasn't much coordination going on. So we're going to show you a short 5-minute video. I think it came to us by way of Brianna on what VOAD is about. And as much as we've heard this, I think this really puts it together concisely. So let's roll that video, Trish.
Disasters happen in every community, and they come in all shapes and sizes, from a simple incident affecting one community to a major catastrophe affecting an entire region. A hurricane, for example, can cause a massive storm surge and powerful winds, which can lead to flooding, collapsed buildings, fire, loss of power, and other consequences. When these widespread impacts cascade and multiply, we have a catastrophe on our hands. The government will immediately initiate a response to address these challenges. And in the Emergency Operations Center, or EOC, the emergency managers will activate plans to understand the scope of the disaster, to ensure that help reaches those in trouble, and to coordinate police officers, firefighters, and medical teams to make communities safe and secure as soon as possible. There are also a number of non-governmental, community, and faith-based agencies and organizations that are active during a disaster and will leap into action and work with the government to provide emergency food, shelter, supplies, and more to those in need. The problem is that there is often little communication between different agencies and organizations serving the same community. And even though they can help one another, they may not be aware of each other's efforts. Without information about the operations of other organizations, they could potentially hurt their local recovery effort by duplicating resources, wasting funding and time, putting field staff in danger, and even directly hindering another organization's work. For example, let's say that we encounter a certain community that's been affected by a disaster, and there are two organizations that have decided to lend a hand and supply much-needed resources. Since they're not communicating with each other, imagine they are both providing home cleanup kits. But neither of them is providing food, which the community needs. With a quick exchange of information, one of the organizations could start providing meals. This way, two of the community's needs will be met. During a disaster, these connections are best made through communication networks coordinated with the local Office of Emergency Management. These networks bring together community organizations and agencies during a response. Since the emergency managers in the EOC have a big picture view of what is happening, they can interact and share information. An example of one of these communication networks is the local Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, or VOAD. VOAD is a network of non-governmental, community, and faith-based agencies and organizations that specialize in disaster services and convene on a regular basis for information exchange, even when there are no disasters. Although each agency or organization is in charge of its own operation, the members communicate with one another so they can share emergency information and coordinate emergency efforts to provide vital services to those in need. Oftentimes, VOAD has a representative that sits in the EOC with the emergency managers and can help provide critical information on unmet needs and available resources. Some are affiliated with national organizations and should link with them, as these larger agencies will be present during a disaster as well. It is critical to understand that these connections cannot be formed during the chaos that surrounds a catastrophe, We must connect before a disaster strikes and stay connected. Learn how you should connect with your local emergency management office now. From them, you can obtain accurate emergency information and details on how to volunteer. Visit their website and become familiar with the different programs and educational materials that are offered. Sign up for emergency alerts if available. As soon as disaster strikes, check with your local emergency management office to see if it's safe to go into the affected zones, and then determine how you can join the team and help your neighbors. You should also become familiar with the VOAD in your jurisdiction and introduce yourself and your organization or agency so that when disaster strikes, you can be an effective part of that response. To make our communities as safe and secure as possible, we need to bring together all of our resources, connecting our government partners and responders to our professional and voluntary non-governmental agencies active during a disaster, as well as to our neighborhood-based community groups. When we do that, we create an emergency team that has the best experience, the best equipment, and the best local knowledge to deal with any disaster of any shape or size.
So to bring that down to a more practical level, for the last dozen years, I've had the opportunity to serve at the Contra Costa VOAD and also on the state VOAD. And we can turn to the next slide. I've witnessed such things as as many of you have, the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa, the Tubbs fire, Santa Rosa, the Camp Fire up in Paradise and those areas, the Napa earthquake, and of course last year the 2020 pandemic that we're still going through. And on a practical level, we found that the local VOADs, the county VOADs, really become the epicenter of the coordination. In several of these disasters, there was no county VOAD, so it made it rather difficult, but subsequently VOADs have been formed in each of these counties. And as you can see on the screen, anyone who's familiar with VOAD is familiar with the 4 C's: cooperation, communication, coordination, collaboration. I'll just give one example of that with the Camp Fire. We at the state level had coordinating phone calls in which the county VOADs would come on board and would take the lead from the county that was most affected in that particular case. But we'd say, here are the needs. Who has resources to meet those needs? And is anyone else aware of other needs? And we would have up to 100 different organizations represented on the call. I remember one that impressed me was when we said there's really needs for some feeding following the campfires. And I heard the Sikh temple respond, well, we can feed 4,000 people a day. And wasn't even aware of the resources, but because of VOAD, we said that's wonderful. And they were deployed and were serving meals every day. And it was amazing. And that's just one example, because I could go through numerous examples of all the organizations that stepped up and provided cleaning supplies, food, shelter, and this really became enhanced through cooperation with the VOAD organizations, communication with each other. Trish, next slide. And the coordination of their activities and sharing goals, collaborating with this. But this doesn't just happen when an emergency occurs. This has to take place before. Naturally, we tend to reach out to those who we've actually worked with and come to know. And hopefully through this meeting, by each of you putting your names up and letting us know who you are and are seeing each other's faces as much as we can over Zoom, we get more and more familiar with each other so that we know who to reach out to. Our Contra Costa VOAD, next slide, consists of, it's fairly well represented with our executive committee. We have Tom, who introduced this meeting with the Contra Costa Crisis Center, Brianna Taylor with the American Red Cross, Trish Byrne with Contra Costa, Concord Police Department, Eve Berg with White Pony Express, and we have Will McGarvey with the Interfaith Council, Lance Littlejohn with the Church of Jesus Christ, and of course Meredith Gerhart with the county, Contra Costa County. So it's fairly well represented. We are looking for greater involvement, always looking for those areas that are not as well represented, and hoping now to really increase our membership so that as a Contra Costa County VOAD, we can be prepared, get to know each other, get familiar with how we each operate during a disaster that will yet happen in the future. I'd like to turn the time over to Lance Littlejohn at this point.
Dave, I appreciate that recap of kind of like why VOADs exist and why you all should join us as members of our VOAD. It really boils down to relationships, developing relationships, understanding the capabilities of each organization as well as their mission, and working together so that we build confidence in each other, that we can rely on each other, work together, effectively coordinate and collaborate. And then the other part of VOAD that really is critical, I think, is the training piece, the education piece, the increasing our knowledge of how to prepare for a disaster, how to actually, during a disaster, operate and then recover. And so, our VOAD, generally speaking, does between 2 and 4 workshops or training sessions a year to give that kind of support to help us develop the resources. So we're hopeful that all of you will want to join us as members. And it's a really simple process. In terms of requirements, we require you to fill out an application form, which will probably take about 10 minutes. And there's no membership fees. And we look for you to be actively involved so that when we have our membership meetings, you attend, you participate. As Dave was pointing out, knowledge is key in terms of understanding the resources of the organizations and also the needs. And those needs flow from member organizations, they flow from the government leaders, they flow from VOAD, from the California VOAD, and also from the executive members. And so over time, as we develop those relationships and get to know each other better, we become more efficient in what we're trying to do. And it's pretty remarkable over the last year what has happened within our county. Many of you would be aware of a lot of the things that have happened. Just for example, thousands of hygiene kits and meal kits have been delivered to our homeless residents. There was an amazing food box delivery program that was initiated. And again, literally thousands of food boxes delivered to organizations to get to people that were unable to access food in the normal channels because of the COVID-19 restrictions. So there's lots of great things going on. And I think that's one of the benefits of being in VOAD is even if your organization's not directly involved in a particular project, you're able to see the power of the community as it comes together to do amazing things. So hopefully we can get you all on board. Okay, I'm turning it over to somebody. I think Trish. Trish, you're on mute.
Ready for the poll.
Sorry, everyone. We thought we'd kick things off today with a poll. It's anonymous, so give us your input. And it's just to give us a sense of where everyone is in the process of preparing an emergency plan and or a continuity of operations plan. So you're going to see 8 multiple choice questions on the screen. So choose the answer that best suits your situation. And even if you don't have either plan in place, please go ahead and complete all of the questions, particularly 3 through 8, because you may well find you have actually completed that work anyway. And so for those of you that joined us by phone, I'll read the questions aloud and you can think about what's being asked and perhaps write down your answers. and join with us as I share the results. So you'll see the poll on screen. There is a scroll bar to the right. So use the scroll bar to navigate between the various questions. And as I said, there are 8. So you should be seeing it on screen now. So the first question, does your organization have an emergency plan or a continuity of operations plan in place? And please choose yes, no, or your plan is currently being developed. So that's your first question. Is everybody seeing this? I'm not seeing any answers go up. Yeah, okay. Question number 2, if you have an emergency plan or a continuity of operations plan, how often do you review the plan? Every 6 months? Annually? We don't review the plan, we don't have a plan, or other. Question 3, have you identified what risks your organization is most likely to encounter based on your geographical location? Yes or no? Are your organization's essential functions clearly defined? Yes or no? Number 5, do you have an alternate facility identified and use agreements in place if your primary place of operation is unavailable during a disaster? Yes or no? Number 6, have you identified your organization's essential records and resources? Yes and no? Number 7, are your contacts, both internal and external, accurate, accessible remotely, and up to date? Yes or no? And the final question, do your delegations of authority cover necessary functional activities during a disaster? And the options are yes, no, or we don't have delegations of authority in place. So I'm just going to wait a few moments. We have 44% of you, 50% of you have answered. So as I said, go ahead and scroll through, use the scroll bar on the right-hand side to scroll through all of the questions. So we're sitting at 63%. Just give it a few more moments. Okay, so we're at 66% of you have voted. Thank you, 69%. Just give it a couple of seconds and then we'll go ahead and we'll share the results, and it will just give us an idea of where this group stands in this process. Okay, so we're at 72%. I think that's a pretty good reflection. Let me go ahead and end the polling and share the results, and we can have a look at where the group was, or is rather. So question 1, does your organization have an emergency plan or a continuity of operations plan in place? It's great to see that 62% of you do have one of those in place. 8% no, but we're going to help you take care of that today. And then 31% of you currently have a plan in development, which is great. So hopefully the information we'll share today will help you through that process. Question number 2, how often do you review either your emergency plan or your continuity of operations plan? We can see that the majority of you, 46%, review it annually. 8% of you review it every 6 months, and then the remaining don't review the plan or don't have a plan. Some are in other. I'm guessing they're the ones that are in the process of developing a plan. So have you identified what risks your organization is most likely to encounter based on your geographical location? And that's wonderful. 100% of you have gone ahead and identified those risks, which is a key part to developing a plan. Are your organization's essential functions clearly defined? 85% of you have done that. The 15% who haven't, we're going to help you get that done today and help you with the process. Number 5, do you have an alternate facility identified and a use agreement in place in case your primary location wasn't available during a disaster? And this is reasonably split along the same line, 62% yes and 42% no. This will be covered during today's presentation as well, and that's an important part of a continuity of operations plan. Number 6, have you identified your organization's essential records and resources? 77% of you have, 23% not yet, but we'll help you get there today. Number 7 are your contacts, internal and external, accessible remotely and up to date. Very similar to the previous question, 73% yes, 31% no. Hopefully after today, that will be a key task for you. And our final question, do your delegations of authority cover necessary functional activities during a disaster? 54% of you, yes. 4% of you no, and 42% of you don't have delegations of authority in place yet. And hopefully that's something that will help you rectify after today's presentation. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Zach. I can get rid of this square off the screen.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Zach Adenov. I was until maybe a year ago a senior emergency planner with Contra Costa County. One of the things that I worked on was the continuity of operations plan for the county departments. So I have a little bit of experience talking over continuity of operations. And I guess we'll go ahead and go to the next slide and dive into things. So, and by the way, just judging from the responses to the survey, I guess about half of you can probably just go ahead and take a nap for the next 20 or 25 minutes, because it seems like a lot of y'all have taken care of a lot of this already, which is great to see. But so first off, an emergency operations plan versus a continuity of operations plan. Emergency operations is more about continuing your services to your clients, as opposed to a continuity of operations plan, which is keeping your organization running. There's definitely overlap between the two, but an emergency plan will also include things like evacuations, and that's not what continuity of operations is about. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So this is a quick definition of it. I feel like I already covered it. Important thing is, with any sort of plan you're writing, be sure to utilize an all hazards approach. You end up running into trouble if you just, well, one, you spend a lot of time if you start writing plans for every single possible disaster. And two, it's a disaster usually because you had no way of seeing it coming. This last year has been a really good example of that. So next slide. All right, the planning process. So this is a big section that I could realistically talk about for a long time, but I will say the first step in any planning process regarding, or what I've found in emergency planning of any type, continuity of operations too, is getting top-down support. I think a lot of you are familiar with the fact that in emergency planning, you're usually dealing with people who the emergency planning, continuity of operations, any of that is a second or possibly third hat that they're wearing. So you've really got to look to the higher ups in an organization to, we'll say, encourage people to take part in the process, but a lot of y'all may be familiar with the fact that it takes a little bit more sometimes than just nicely worded encouragement. So that's really one of the first steps you need, is basically convincing your organization that this is something that needs to happen. And then, so if you have this top-down support, your next step is the idea of bottom-up work. You need to have a lot of the operational level personnel, because they're the ones that are going to be executing a lot of this. So you need to work on the breadth of the organization, making sure that people from every facet of it are involved, because with continuity of operations, it's about all the operations across the organization. Now, that being said, you also need other individuals involved. The clients are an important component, as well as outside organizations that you may be working with. That really wonderful video actually made a good point that you may be utilizing services or trying to communicate with groups like the government, for example. So they should also be communicated with, at least in part, for your continuity of operations plan. And I always tell people, it's not the plan, it's the planning process. If you have one person just checking a box and writing this, you might as well not waste their time. This is about everybody involved knowing what the solutions are and knowing who everybody involved is. I always say it is not the time to be exchanging business cards during a disaster. You want to know who you're talking to when you're desperately calling on the phone, needing to initiate some protocol or procedure. Let's see, next slide, please. Okay, and I feel like the poll gave away a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about, but hopefully I can add a little bit of information to them. So essential functions and services. This is obviously a lot of the priorities. Well, first you're prioritizing everything your organization does. So usually at the top of an organization's continuity of operations plan is continuing services to clients. But have you thought about the payroll for the paid personnel? Have you thought about fundraising? How are you going, where do those necessarily rank? Because you can't just leave them aside until the disaster is done. If a disaster is going 3 or 4 months or longer, as the last year once again has shown, you can't just say, oh, well, we're really running, we're redlining everything, trying to get our clients all the services they need. We'll just leave payroll for the next 4 or 5 months and hope that nobody has, rent coming up anytime soon. So you have to keep an eye towards all of the essential functions, towards every department, every facet of your organization. And that's where it comes in saying, okay, really prioritizing, all right, how long can we realistically wait to start working on this? Because even when it becomes all hands on deck, you are going to have to eventually admit that you might have to start pulling back a little bit to make sure people are getting paid, to make sure that your fundraising is continuing during a disaster. So that's, I think, a good example of just the breadth of essential functions that may need to be addressed during a disaster. So next slide. All right, risk factors. This one, fairly straightforward. You're looking at what the various hazards are that you could run into. But be sure not to limit that purely to if your offices are going to get hit by an earthquake. One thing to just remain mindful of is the other locations that you utilize, the other organizations that you may be interacting with. If your organization that you are working alongside, they get hit by an earthquake, you need to have an idea of how you can continue providing services to your clients. And then there are other things beyond just, like I said, your offices. There are, just the physical risks. Cybersecurity is a really big one, and we'll talk a little bit about files, databases, things like that a little later on. But try to be broad with the possible risks that you could face. Some of these, and I guess you could say, try to be, once again, try to use that all hazards approach, because like I love using this last year because it was just such a unexpected event, or unplanned for event, I should say, is okay, now you're running into a shortage of manpower for whatever reason. It may be that your offices are fine, your physical infrastructure is fine, but now you found yourself with a quarter of the workforce, half the workforce, because It can be anything that an earthquake has hit and now half your workforce is on the other side of a bridge that no longer works. Or a quarter of your workforce is having to stay home in order to take care of their kids. So that's where that all hazards planning comes in. And so just keep that in mind as you're also identifying specific risks that you may come across. Okay, next. So resources. I've done a lot of research into high reliability organizations, and one of the first steps and second and third steps really for that is knowing what you have. So know what resources you have in place, have a good idea of just what you have, workforce, hardware, equipment, everything, so that you know what you can respond with. And another thing is knowing where it's at. That comes into sort of that geographic understanding. Your personnel count as resources and knowing what their capabilities are. If you've got people that understand the ins and outs of, let's say, if your HR people also understand your operations processes, then you're in much better shape during that first week when you need everybody, you need all hands on deck to provide your services. So just having an idea of what your resources are, what your capabilities are is very important. And these are things that truthfully, I feel like should be written down in a plan, because in the process of writing that, like I talked about, now you have a much broader group of people that know what your capabilities are. And knowing what capabilities are, I always fall back when I was in school. They had a great example of the Delaware Emergency Management Organization saying, oh, well, if we lose power, we'll just call the National Guard and they'll bring in 50 generators and we'll be good to go. It was at least a year until they actually brought in the National Guard into the planning process. And the National Guard said, we've got like 6 generators and we don't know if those are even going to work with your buildings. So if you are planning, even across your organization, know what the expectations are that other people have for you and know what the capabilities are. Let's see, next. So decision makers and activation. Knowing who your chief decision makers are. This was really one of the ones that was already in place. Let me check my notes real quick. Yep. So knowing who your chief decision makers are, and then knowing who makes decisions if you can't find those people. Knowing who your major decision makers are, who your lower level decision makers are, just really knowing who can decide what needs to happen. So that's where a very top-heavy organization that has to go straight to the president, the board of directors, whatever, to make major decisions is going to have a lot of trouble in the face of a disaster, which is why it's very important to have that line of succession, knowing, okay, we can't get in touch with the president. Who gets to make decisions after that? And then who gets to make decisions after that person? And at the lower level, at your operations points, okay, you've got your site manager. Do they have the power to decide in case their site goes down? Can they decide, okay, well, here's another location, I'm going to work and figure out that location. So having that in place is critical as far as who can make decisions, what kind of decisions they can make. And part of it is who decides to activate the coup and who can decide, all right, who gets to make the call that we're going to call everybody and bring all hands on deck. And next slide. So this is about communication within the organization itself. And within this, I include alerting people that something bad has happened in the first place. So that means, in reality, when I worked at Contra Costa and every time outside of Contra Costa, I always say people should be signing up for the community warning system. That is the fastest and best way to know, okay, something major has happened in about as quick a time as you can possibly get. But from there, how do you communicate to your organization something bad has happened? How do these personnel know, all right, here's what we have to do next? Do you have phone trees? Do you have an automated system? Do you just work off of email? If your decision is we're going to work purely off of email and the internet goes down, it's good to have a backup in place. And that's where a continuity of operations plan comes in. So, and this, I also include automatic procedures. I use examples sort of like CERT or Red Cross is a good one. Self-deployment is a thing for organizations. So you need to know, and your people on the ground need to know, all right, something bad has happened, and we can get out there and just get started directing traffic, even just meeting at a certain location in order to start communicating and kick off your operations, even if you're not really that first line. And going back to that video, these need to really be coordinated. These automated protocols, self-deployment, you really have to talk to your Office of Emergency Management first, because if you self-deploy, they're not going to pay you. You're not going to get reimbursed for any sort of initial actions, initial disaster activities you take, unless you have an agreement with them that says, yes, we're going to let you guys automatically start doing your work. We're going to let you start making meals immediately, things like that. So payment may depend on it. And I know that's important to keep a lot of organizations running. Okay, next slide, please. So external communications. This sort of runs the line of some things that have already been touched on. I like to talk about, and this is where your planning process in the first place comes in. This is why your external partners as well as your clients need to be involved, because you need to know how to get in touch with them. You need to know what sort of communication they're going to need. Using the Office of Emergency Management as an example, suffice to say they're going to be busy, which means they need to know, and you need to know ahead of time, all right, what information needs to be communicated and how quickly can we communicate it? A lot of times there's just a quick survey that an Office of Emergency Management will have pulled together, just saying, all right, how many people are in need? What do they need? Done. But you need to work on that communication beforehand so that you're not trying to figure everything out haphazardly afterward. Any other community-based organizations that you work with, you need to know what their operations are going to be like. If they're going to start self-deploying in a certain way or starting to work on certain things, that's where that lack of overlap comes in, so that you know, well, here's what their operations are going to be, here's what our operations are going to be, here's how we're going to communicate about that. And critically also comes in the clients. How are you going to talk with them? Is the plan purely email once again? Is it phone calls? Do you tell your clients, all right, when we get our operations up and running, which should be 2 to 3 days out, just start coming in and getting more food. Like, we should be able to get food going 3 days out. You can just show up and we should be up and running. It really depends on knowing your population, knowing how you can communicate with them. So have that all worked out, know how you're planning to communicate. And yeah, let's see. And that also gives them the opportunity, if you know what your continuity of operations is like, they can really figure out, okay, what are their needs going to be in the meantime? And how can they prepare for that? Okay, next slide, please. All right, alternate/temporary locations. So I've actually hit on this a lot already. This comes into risk management. It comes into knowing what risks are going to happen in your various locations, where are your offices, where are your client services. I use firehouses as an example. Oh, actually, no, there was a organization, I think it was one of the port, I'm not going to say which port, but they had their emergency operations center all ready to go. And they also had their backup emergency operations center ready to go. Unfortunately, they hadn't done quite enough research, very basic research, and realized that since they were using port land, that all of it was in a flood zone. And those are some of the basic things you need to be looking at when you were looking at your alternate and temporary locations. And it's not just for your offices, as mentioned, it's for your client services. Do you know what your backups are going to be? And that gives your decision makers a little bit more of a clear idea of what's going to be happening. Where can the managers report to if you know that one of your buildings is no longer safe due to an earthquake? And one great point was make sure there are agreements in place. It can be very difficult if you're going to try to start working at a location, or you decide, okay, here's our backup location, it's going to be great. And then you find out, well, no, they're actually going to be utilizing it Monday through Friday because they're still working. Those are the other people that you need to bring to the planning table when you are working. You can work alongside large organizations, you can go with smaller ones, but just talk to them beforehand. When you are planning out your backup sites, make sure you've checked with them. If you can, have some sort of memorandum of understanding just to kind of work things out beforehand. So once again, you're not exchanging business cards during the disaster. And next slide, please. So vital information and backup procedures. Luckily, it looked like a lot of y'all had that kind of in place at this point. Luckily, the cloud has become really easily accessible, so people can have information accessible elsewhere, but you need to make sure of that. You can't have all of your phone lists maintained by one person in an Excel document on their personal computer, because that's the one person, I guarantee you, something bad happens, that's the one person that's going to be out of communication that you can't find. Hopefully they're okay, but you're not going to be able to find them at that point. So it's more, and that's where it comes in, not having just the one person doing the planning. You need to have everybody able to access the critical information. And you also need to make sure that you have hard copies of a lot of this stuff. If the internet goes down and you need access to that phone list again, it's good to have a hard copy. Really, if you're going very hard at this, you're going to have one at your backup site and you're going to have one at your main site. And it's down to you to decide what you need as far as operations in the face of internet going down, in the face of you being unable to access your main site. What sort of files are you keeping at your main site that you can't do without? That can also go with the resources we mentioned before. What do you have available? How many computers can you access? What are you going to need to do if you can't even set foot into your main offices? How are you going to start up work again if there are no computers, if you can't access the files there? So vital information, backup procedures, it covers a lot of different files. It covers a lot of different resources. And let's see, next. So staying up to date, part of that includes exercises, just sit down at a table with a bunch of the other people in your organization, a few people from outside your organization, the critical personnel, and then just talk through something bad happens. You can go off of a scenario, you can go off of just a general conversation, something to get people thinking about what can happen and what needs to occur. It's a great way of figuring out what the shortcomings in your continuity of operations plan is, or are, and it's also a way of keeping it fresh in people's minds. And both that and updating the plan, organizations have turnover. By doing the exercises, by doing planning updates, you're letting people know, okay, you're new here. Here's what we've got in place. So that's where planning updates, once again, you can't just have one person doing it and checking a box. It's a way of bringing in people who aren't familiar with it, either outside the organization, within the organization, your major client personnel. It's a way of getting everybody familiar with it once again, because you might have done an amazing job 2 years ago, but your emergency management personnel have changed. Half of your client base has changed out, and you've had turnover in 2 of your major positions. Whoever was involved in the first place is now basically teaching everybody, here's what's going on in a situation where we need to utilize our continuity of operations plan. So staying up to date is just as much about teaching people as it is adding a little bit of information or changing a few phone numbers on your continuity of operations plan. And I believe that is just about everything I've got. Brianna, did I forget anything?
No, Zach, I think you covered everything. And now we're going to go to some breakout groups and put all this information into action. So I'm going to turn it over to Trish to talk about breakout groups. Thank you,
Brianna.
Zach.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Brianna. Hi, everyone. So we're going to ask you all to participate in a continuity of operation exercise that will take us about 15 minutes. So at this point, I recommend that you either do a screen grab of the slide that's up right now, or as my 80-year-old volunteers taught me, you can use, sorry, can we go back one, Brianna?
Sure.
You can use your phone just to take a quick photo of this, because this is going to give you the scenario. So, and then we're going to divide you into about 10 breakout rooms to complete the exercise. For those of you that joined by phone, only users who joined using the Zoom app or something called an H323 SIP device can participate in the breakout room. But don't worry, stay with us in the main room, and my colleague Eve will lead you guys through the exercise as well. So here's the scenario. You work for a nonprofit food distribution agency. Your group is tasked with putting together a continuity of operations plan. Your NGO has 20 employees, 50 volunteers, and 1,000 clients. Some of these work at the main office, others are at off-site locations. So on the next slide, we're going to show you what your assignment is based on the room that you're going to be allocated to. So if you can give me the next slide up, please, Brianna. So same deal here. I recommend that you do a screen grab of this slide, or you take a photo with your phone to take with you into the meeting room. So when you're allocated to your breakout room, you will see your room number on the screen beside your name. So make sure you take a note of your room number, as it corresponds to the group number here and determines the exercise that you're going to be asked to complete. So for instance, room number 1 will be discussing the planning process, and we're asking you to identify the assumptions upon which your plan is based, list the objectives of the plan, and list the sections of the plan. Room number 2 will deal with essential functions and services. So identify the organization's essential functions and services, what ones are vital to continuing operations in a disaster, and why. Room number 3, risk factors. Complete an all hazards risk assessment of the organization's facilities and identify all potential hazards. Room number 4, dealing with resources, identify internal and external resources that can be harnessed to enable the organization to continue to operate during a disaster. Room number 5, decision makers / activation, determine plan activation procedures, develop a decision matrix to assist in the decision to activate your plan. Room 6, communication on the internal side, identify methods of notification, name groups who commences notification, and required responses of all organizational personnel upon notification. Room number 7, external communications. How are you going to reach out to your clients and partners regarding your relocation to the continuity site, or how you're going to change up doing business? Room number 8, your alternate temporary location. Identify one or several, depending. Identify the procedure and the relocation procedure from the primary facility to the continuity facility. Describe the operational capacity at the continuity site and how you'll get there within, for example, 12 hours of plan activation. Room number 9, vital information backup procedures. Establish best practices for backing up your data and set a goal for how much data you wish to recover post-disaster. And then finally, room 10, staying up to date. Identify who is responsible for keeping the plan up to date and how often you'll review and update your plan and how you're going to coordinate the review process. So let me start working on the rooms.
Trish, while you work on the rooms, are there any questions about this?
Yes, probably. I don't know what they are yet.
Well, my
Okay.
colleagues are going to be popping into the various rooms, so as just to make sure to help you and see, and then we'll all come together afterwards and share what we've discovered. So I'm going to open all the rooms. This is when you should see your room number and then an option to join.
Hold on one second, Brianna. There was a request to go back to the first slide so someone can screenshot that.
Okay,
So hopefully, well, we don't seem to be moving to rooms.
Oh, too late. Okay, see you guys in a bit then. Huh?
Okay, so some people we have with us.
okay, so Trish, I can't see anything other than the presentation.
Okay, sorry.
No,
So,
that's okay.
So you don't have an option to join?
I will go into.
Looks like you're room 9. I don't know why you're in there with Lance, which seems interesting.
Well, maybe, can I pop into another room?
You should be able to. Do you see where you have an option to join on the list of rooms? No? Wait till
I went to room 10. There's nobody in there. Where do we send these people?
So I will move you to, what did we say you were going to do?
9 and 10, but I was the only one in 10. So did you send anybody else there?
They did not join. So Eve, if you want to go ahead and help.
Oh, I see. I can see the names here.
You can see them?
Yeah. Oh, I see. There's nobody in 10. So we'll just forget about 10.
Okay, so I see we have John and Tanya here. So Eve, if you wanted to lead a discussion there.
On 10.
On 10. So
Dave's by himself in room 5.
So although we're all here in the room together, you'd like me to start talking with
yeah,
John and Tonya
sure.
and Natalie and Zach. Hi, here we go. So I think we don't have a topic assigned, but what we might do, because it did feel like a few of us are experienced planners, is we could start with the first discussion point and see how, and we might be able to move on to the second and third. We can just see how far we go. And And let's see, I'm going to make my screen a little bit bigger here. Okay. So we've got the notes, and I'm happy to remind you all. Were you able to take a screenshot? So I can go over who we are. Nonprofit food distribution agency. We're putting together a continuity of operations plan. We're relatively small, but we have 1,000 clients, and both on-site and off-site. So then if we looked at discussion point number 1, and we talked about just the initial planning process, the question is, or the ask is to identify assumptions upon which the plan would be based and to list the objectives of our plan and the sections of the plan.
Okay, we are
Tonya?
the reason I didn't join, I was assigned to group 5. I did not join because I have lots of experience. So I just wanted to listen to see what people, you know, I don't want to ruin other people's learning opportunities. And so I was just listening, and that was my my objective today. I didn't know that we were going to be in the agenda, that it was going to be an active workshop.
Got it. And that's, is it Tonya?
Yeah, it's Tanya.
Oh, Tanya. Okay, that's great. Well, Natalie, how about you? Is this new to you? How experienced are you with emergency operations planning?
Relatively new until about a year ago. And that definitely changed quite a bit. So I actually was trying to jump in and out. I don't know. I kept going to my breakout room and kept getting kicked out. And so now I'm back here with you. So I'm sorry if I missed quite a bit what was being said.
No, not at all. That's fine. Well, should we stick here? Do you think, John, are you happy here with this group? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to stick together. Well, do you want to say a little bit more? So I did sort of set the stage, and the stage is we're a small nonprofit organization or medium-sized nonprofit, but we have 1,000 clients, and we've been tasked with putting together a continuity of operations plan. We've got staff on site, we've got staff off site, and now we're looking at the, and now we're going on to talk about planning. And so what they're asking us to do is identify the assumptions which we'll base our plan on, objectives, and then the sections of our plan. Now, I have to say, Tanya, you would probably be a more skilled facilitator than I am. I've been on the VOAD executive committee for a number of months, but I joined because the organization that I just joined a year ago, right at the onset of COVID, did not have an operations plan in place. And so I'm among the category of putting together an operations plan for the organization. And really, I'm like at create a team and early assessment. So you're probably, so your skills might be very helpful here. But if we're
okay, well, I mean, I'm happy to have that kind of conversation. I didn't take a screenshot, but in order to, when it talks about the, you know, what are the assumptions of the plan, those are things like, well, first of all, that, you know, it's usually simple things like we have enough people to respond, right? So whatever that number of, if we've got 20 of staff of 20, I don't know what the bare minimum is, right? If we can operate with 15 people or 10 people, but identify how many people that, and that's an assumption. So in order for the plan to work, we have to have at least 50%, 75% or whatever of our staff. We're not planning for, you know, we're not planning for what type of events are we planning for? Are we planning for a major regional event? Are we, you know, so because depending on the size of the event and the resources that we have available to us, that impacts our ability to respond. So a lot of the times, like a business will say, I don't have, we're not planning for a regional earthquake. So we're not planning for, an earthquake that takes out all of the Northern California area or impacts, South Bay and East Bay or whatever. So those are some assumptions that you could put in place. In this plan, I would think it would be staffing, that we'd have the suppliers, because we're a food bank. So our food suppliers are, again, some estimate 50-75% of the suppliers are going to be available. And that those would be probably the two most important things. I'm not sure, to be able to deliver to our 1,000 clients, right? And then you look at what are the critical things that we have to do to get food to people, right? So critical function would probably be, we have to be able to accept orders, right? We have to we have to make orders, and we have to be able to, again, accept shipments. And then I don't, if we do some kind of distribution, if they're boxes or whatever, but being able to do that and then distribute them however we do, if people come to us or if we go to them. But, and then the timeframes, like how critical would those functions be? Maybe because of whatever the business interruption is, they might be more critical, right? If our constituents, those 1,000 constituents, are impacted by the same event that we are. Anyway, those are just some of the things to consider.
So I think that is terrific. So in terms of assumptions, we're looking at staffing, we're looking at suppliers, also probably the impact on the recipients. So do we still have 1,000 people who are actively eating the food? And then the objectives. So the assumptions now, you talked about communication, supplies, transportation. Those would all be parts of, you'd have to address all of those in the plan. And how would you guys, what would you think would be the objectives? We've got our assumption. So, I mean, the objectives is continuity of service, is to continue to get food to those that need it. Would that be, does that make sense?
I would think that it would be to get it to the 1,000 clients. If we're going to say we're going to prioritize and only give it to the ones that really need it, then we're going to have to create a mechanism for doing that, like understanding their need and evaluating their need. So I don't know how you do that part.
Right, and that would be tricky to do in advance, maybe, because it's so dependent on what the emergency
because you could
is.
say we're only giving food to the people in these counties or this, area that's most impacted or whatever.
So anybody else, John or Natalie, do you have ideas about what the other objectives? So Tanya mentioned the question, do we prioritize our recipients? With, I guess, kind of the driving objective, do we all agree that the driving objective is to get the food to the people that need it?
I would say so. So for ours, I'm in housing. So for us,
good.
the big push for us and our continuity plan was that, if people need to move, if people need to lease up, especially during a pandemic, those are obviously things that we need to make sure happen. So even if we were able to get other waivers and things like that in place with HUD to buy us some time with our recertifications and things, but if someone lost their income or their job and now required additional assistance from us because of the lack of income, right, that's something that we considered immediate and necessary that we needed to do, so that way we can now cover that portion of the rent, and that's one less thing the family needed to do. So housing, I think, is like a basic need, just like food and other things is a necessity. So for us, we just looked at what the most important parts of our functions were, and narrowed it down to those. So in the event of an emergency, we would have to figure out a way to mobilize and ensure that those operations continued.
And because we're a small group here, and Tanya's an expert, and Natalie, John, I'd love to hear sort of what your background is about this. And Natalie, I'd really like to hear, so you said that it's just that you've recently become a planner and that COVID really, inspired that for the organization that you're with. But can you talk a little bit more about what it looked like and how how did that all come about? And how did you learn about COOP planning?
To be frank, we all just kind of, the entire executive management team ended up in a room together where each person said, okay, in my department, this is what has to continue. This is what has to happen. And we all figured out a way to ensure that continued. And that's where our plan essentially was born. And it kept changing, as we saw. That changes every single day. So the only thing that my feedback or input on this is, like, obviously make sure that your communication channels are in place, and that no matter whatever is happening, you need to be able to communicate with your staff as well as your management team. Because as we saw with COVID, the precautions and all of that were changing daily. So even if you put together a BCP in the morning, it had changed by that afternoon or by that next day. So we ended up spending more time, at least on the administrative side, developing and redeveloping a policy that just kept changing. So I think highlighting the more, like, this is our goal, this is what's absolutely most important, and just kind of narrowing it down to like very basically what needs to be your ongoing kind of responsibilities, and then ensure that you can address those, and having, specific people in charge of it. I guess is my only feedback. Because like I said, when everything keeps changing so fast, I mean, we haven't had fires, we haven't had floods, we haven't had anything like that. You just need to make sure that you at least have the person who's running point on each of those essential functions. So if it's getting food out for you guys, I would say, okay, who's in charge of what region, and ensure that person is going to oversee that, and then has their team to execute. It would be like my only input on that. But for us, it was literally everybody came to the table, kind of the department heads, and said, okay, in my department, we have XYZ that has to happen no matter what. Everything else, we'll figure it out. And while I think it's easy for us to think that everything is important, everything needs to continue to happen, in the event of an actual emergency, there's very few things that actually need to happen as part of our responsibilities and essential functions.
That makes perfect sense. And I have more questions, but I'm noticing that our room, which is actually the general room, is now full. So we should probably turn it back to Trish. Is that you?
Yeah, we're just waiting for a couple of the rooms to close. Here they come back in now. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you found the exercise valuable. So we'll just quickly take a spokesperson from each of the various rooms and just briefly share what you decided or agreed upon based on your discussions. So if I could have somebody from room number 1, and they were assigned the planning process, and if somebody could just talk about what you guys discussed and decided and share.
So I'm Nora from the food bank. So we discussed, trying to get our agency up and running within 12 hours of the event. And we talked about the importance of communication and, making sure that our staff and volunteers that run the operation were safe, and understanding that we may have some fallout. So having some backup plans in order to help us get back to business. And then we talked about communicating out to the people that are getting services from us, and how to do that, and using social media to make sure that they know that, we're up and running and things are back online.
Perfect. Nicely done, room 1. Thank you, Nora. So room number 2, where they were dealing with essential functions and services, and they were going to identify the organization's essential functions and services. So I'm going to have a spokesperson from room number 2.
Well, good afternoon. I think I raised my hand. Hi, Trish.
Hi, Marcel.
So team did great. Basically, I mean, we had to make a lot of assumptions like you do in emergency management around utilities still being on, that we're delivering to the home and not a congregate type setting. But obviously essential functions are transportation, because we're delivering, volunteer coordination, but also the communications piece with staff, volunteers, the recipients. Again, we even talked about bringing in public information officer in case there had needed to be a different message around the disaster than our normal methodology in which we deliver the food. We also don't want to assume that there weren't going to be some donations, because people always want to come to the aid of into times of disaster. And so we could be dealing with some donation management things as well. But obviously, aside from the delivery and transport, acquiring, the making sure that the providers and the vendors that we do this food service with are still up and functional, and that those resources are still in place. We talked a little bit about packaging and storaging and keeping safe and all that, but usually that would fall on the vendor, I would think. I think that's about it. Did I miss anything, team?
Sounds good.
Sounds great. Thank you. And interesting how, room 1 and 2 were separate, but there's a lot of, correlation between the 2 rooms, which is really nice to see. So, okay, room 3 had to deal with risk factors, and they were going to conduct an all hazards risk assessment of the organization's facilities and let us know what those potential hazards were. So could I have a spokesperson from room 3?
I'm Frances, and I wrote down the notes for our team, so I'll be the spokesperson. Let's see, the hazards that we identified included wildfires and smoke, weather hazards, including and especially extreme heat that would affect our county, traffic being shut down on the major corridors that would affect our ability to get staff and volunteers, get our and the food safely to distribution sites. BART could shut down, especially in the case of a power outage. A power outage or blackout also would affect refrigeration. So we'd need a plan to quickly distribute the perishables, especially keeping in mind that if we're having a blackout, our clients probably are having one also. So their refrigeration would also be down. We opened up our brains and even imagined an airplane crashing down. Toxic spills because of Chevron and the oil refineries in the Contra Costa County. With a toxic spill, we might not be able to use the water. We might not have access to fresh water, or we might not be able to safely breathe, like with wildfires also. And of course, earthquakes, crumbled buildings, and downed power lines, and the hazards of after tremors. And then we realized the last one we listed was a pandemic, because we realized we were like fish swimming in water. We're not even noticing it anymore. But yes, the hazards of a public health pandemic.
That's great. And thank you for going outside the box. That's exactly what this process is meant to promote. So nicely done, room 3. Room 4 was going to talk about resources, identifying the internal and external resources that could be harnessed. So do I have a spokesperson from room 4?
You bet. My name's Diana Brennan. I work for the food bank of Contra Costa and Solano with Nora. So this was a little closer to home, but yeah, we identified both internal and external resources. The internal were, largely employees, making sure that there's a connection with folks beyond the office, whether that's texting or a home number, but particularly, mobile and landline, depending on how the phone lines are functioning at the time. Depending on the food bank itself and its size, things like payroll and online resources, are those backed up? Are they accessible remotely? If they, are all stored on a server in the office, should they be backed up? The volunteers would certainly be considered an internal resource, as well as any equipment, vehicles that they might have that could be accessed if the site itself wasn't damaged. Externally, we thought resources would be suppliers, any food suppliers that they might work with, agencies in the area that they might work with or partner with, churches, schools, things like that. Obviously, there'd be a need for things like fuel to run vehicles or run generators, making sure that was accessible. In the food bank world, there are state and national resources, depending on if they have any of those connections, whether that's a larger local food bank or through the state or through Feeding America. Donors and corporate partners might be willing to step up and help if those are local connections that they have. Cold storage might be a factor if they either have a lot of things in cold storage or need to store things, so they need to find resources to do that. And then, working with, if they did still want to continue food distributions to their clients, working with emergency distribution sites or a network of, local churches or schools, things like that, just to be able to continue to get their food out in the community as they're able to.
Great. I like how you thought about networking beyond your own organization. That's really key and feeding into that bigger chain. So thank you, room 4. So room 5, we're responsible for the decision makers or the activation. They were going to tell us how the plan would be activated. Do I have someone from room 5 to share?
Sure. When Zach was the only other person in the room with me, I knew that it would devolve upon me to report. So he said, and as far as the decision activation matrix, I think there'd be 3 elements. One would be what level of a disaster at which you deploy. And so we'd list the types of things that have been discussed and what level of deployment would be merited. Number 2 is who is authorized to deploy. And so you come up with a list of, let's say, the senior officer or CEO, and the next in line and the next line go down as far as authority could be delegated to deploy. And following the rules of incident command, that would be really whoever is on site, the most senior person on site would have the authority to deploy. And then Zach pointed out another key element there that you'd want to know what resources each person is allowed to deploy at, what level. So obviously the CEO or the senior officer would have the fullest capability of deployment, and then it might be limited as we go down the track. So that matrix would be those 3 areas: when to deploy what sort of disasters, who are those that can deploy, and what authority level each of those have in deploying.
Nice to include the authority level too. That's key. So thank you, Dave. Room 6, we're dealing with internal communications, and we're going to share how they would go about notifying their own internal personnel. So do I have somebody from room 6?
Yes, this is Mark. Shout out to Dave Christensen, longtime old friend from growing up. In our group, we talked about how we would notify everybody. And so redundancy was mentioned about using texting, email, and a phone tree. If someone fell through the cracks for any of those, then it would be nice to have a website established where they could go to get information, or just call a peer and find out from another personnel what the information is in case they did not get reached by any of the previous methods. Also, carrier pigeon that can also double as food. Not that one, that's just...
Hey, whatever works. No, great job. Thank you. There's always, different possibilities. So it's all about thinking how you get your message out there. So I say go for it if you've got those pigeons and they're going to come back to you. So great job. Okay.
Some of the other thoughts were also, looking at social media. And a lot of it has to do with, how quickly do you need to get the information out, but also receive it as well. And while phone trees might take, some time to call people, blasting it out through social media for texting and emailing, or, like a one-to-many kind of an approach too. The other thought is to go outside and look for other resources, like look at the news, what's happening in on the streaming that's going on, Googling maps and other places for information as well. So we definitely want to make sure that we're up to date on information and disseminate, but also receive it in a timely way too, so that people out there who are asking, how are things going, what's going on? Because once you go through recovery, that's another area that we want to make sure that people are safely coming back in or settling themselves out also. So we want to look at those too.
That's a very good point. And intelligence coming in also allows you to be flexible with your plan and your response, which can be key to serving your community as well. So thank you, Jane, for sharing. Sorry, Mark.
I also forgot to mention television. You can just get on the television and watch the news, and that's probably the quickest information that you can get.
Absolutely. Or do an interview with the news and get your message out there as well. So great job. Thank you, room 6. Room 7, we're going to do external communications. How are they going to get in contact with clients and partners? Do I have a spokesperson from room 7?
I am the spokesperson for Julie and I. It was just the two of us. But one of the key things was if you don't have a PIO officially like on staff or as part of your group, make sure that you have somebody who takes on that role so that you can include that contact information in any kind of communication that you are doing. Obviously, we looked at, the scenario of if the internet is up and running and everything great, then we can do social media posts to Facebook, Nextdoor, Twitter, Instagram, our own networks, whatever. But and also maybe do an update on our website to tell people, where we've moved to, et cetera. Get a quick press release out to our media list. So again, if they're interested in getting more information, they could contact the PIO. But just do old school. Put a sign on the old location and put a sign on the new location, because that might be all you have. And if you've got an A-frame, make the sign big enough. So make sure that whoever's in charge of the sign has those kinds of supplies. It has poster board and markers. You got to remember old school.
That's great. That's great. And I love the old school. Never discard that. So thank you for sharing. Okay, room 8, we're responsible for identifying an alternate temporary location and the activation procedures involved in there. Do I have a spokesperson from room 8?
I can speak. Is that okay with everyone, or does anyone else want to speak?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I'll jump in if you miss anything.
Please do. Please do. So we were so lucky, and we had someone from Meals on Wheels in our room who actually kind of experienced this during the pandemic. And our goal was to find a place we could relocate to. So something we talked about was, would it be possible to not have a central location? Something that we are kind of learning through this pandemic is people can work at home, and sometimes having an on-site place isn't as important. We also talked about, if we're delivering meals to people through volunteers, because I think they said there's 100 volunteers might not be available. They might be doing what they need to do to take care of themselves and their families. So we would, possibly do what Meals on Wheels did, which was instead of daily food drop-offs, do weekly food drop-offs, and what could that look like? And then we did kind of go on a tangent a little bit, but that was helpful about just being prepared ahead of time with like emergency food in people's buildings, or having that food on site that we could then distribute. And that emergency food would be good if, the electricity wasn't working or something like that.
In the event that we, instead of being able to evacuate, we may have to shelter in place, and having, the emergency food supply could be beneficial at that time.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And I love how you really thought outside the box and are changing up how you operate in terms of going from maybe a daily distribution to a weekly with a food box, as you said. So that's one of the things these plans should be able to address and be flexible enough to do. So great job, room 8. Thank you. Room 9, going to look at vital information and backup procedures and best practices for backing up your data. Do I have somebody from room 9?
I can speak. It was Lance and I in our group, and essentially what we would do is I'm at Meals on Wheels Diablo region as well, and we have everything in the cloud. We moved to an all cloud database. Having said that, the cloud is not a guarantee. So it's really important that we understand what we need in its contact information on 4 different areas. Our clients, we may need that. Now, keep in mind, some of these things are protected where we are not able to be sharing them among the organization. So a printed copy of key information needs to be had, and what each organization has to decide what elements of information need to be on it. So perhaps in our case would be the name, their phone number, their physical location, as well as an emergency contact is possibly something, because they may be alone and they may need help, but we may not be able to reach them. And it might be a neighbor or something like that would be a potential thing to keep in there. Our staff, we have a list that goes to the managers, and it's all staff and their names and their physical location, not by address, but by cities and zip code, because they may not be able to access where they need to go to report because of something down or whatever, but they might be available in a different area. So that's the advantage of having the zip codes for your staff, as well as their phone numbers and information there. And we've asked the program leaders to program it all into their phones for their individual teams. And then of course, our partner agencies and vendors, we need to have all that and the current names and contacts for them, as well as a backup, and our volunteers and their names and contacts, and keeping that updated as frequent as needed, but should probably be reviewed at least once a month and printed out in the right places in the grab and go, and potentially in another location. Like for me, I keep it with me in my purse, contacts and so forth for my organization, not for the individual programs.
Great. I love the idea of checking it over monthly. So, and just make that part of your normal business method. So that's great. Thank you for sharing. I'm sorry we are running a little bit late, but this information is just really amazing. And finally, room 10, and they were dealing with staying up to date and who was responsible for keeping the plan up to date and how often. Do I have a spokesperson from room 10? Okay, some people said they've had to drop off. So we know from Zach that we should be looking at that at least annually, but some choose to do it every 6 months. It's just important that all of the information there is up to date. And as Lisa said, if you're changing your staff assignments and contacts, that you know that also needs to go whoever is the keeper of the plan. So, and thank you. I'm going to pass back to Brianna to bring us to a close.
Hi, everyone. Danielle Bell is going to do our drawing for us. Danielle, can you bring that up?
Yes, I'm working on it.
Okay, thank you. So as Danielle calls the names, because all the names are in there, if your name is called, will you please wave or put it in the chat so we know you're here?
And how many winners do we have today?
We have 4. And you'll all be getting a $25 gift card from Target that we hope you will use to purchase some supplies for your organization.
There are your winners.
Okay, so our winners are Sheena Davis, Diana
Here.
Brennan.
Oh, this
Here.
is my lucky day. I'm gonna
I
get a
know.
lottery ticket. I never win anything.
Congratulations.
And Claudia just got off the call, so we'll have to find someone in her place. And Natalie, are you here?
So 2 more.
Okay, so let's see if we can do 2 more.
Another name. Let's see if it does it. I haven't had to do like. Oh, maybe the top or.
Let's see who's here of this group.
Oh, there you go.
Do we have Charlene, Andrew, Tanya, or Amy? Okay, let's go again.
Okay.
Tanya was here. Was it Tanya York?
Yes, it is.
Didn't her name just come up?
Tanya,
Hi,
did
I'm
you-
here.
Let's go with yes, and then that way you have your 4.
Great.
Okay, so our 4 are, if you were one of the 4, please raise your hand, so, or
Maybe put in the chat room your
if you
email.
put it in the chat, so we make sure we have all of you. Okay, we have Diana.
I'm getting mine here. Sorry, I'm typing a little slow.
Okay, Tanya. I just want to make sure we have all 4 of you. Well, while you're doing that, we just want to thank you so much for joining us today. We hope this was helpful for all of you. We will have our next workshop is coming up in July. Listos will be doing a special preparedness workshop that will actually be 2 Saturday mornings in July. It will be in Spanish, so we hope to really reach out to other parts of our community so that we can help them be prepared for disasters also. We will send out a follow-up email to all of you with a link to the membership form. You don't have to be a member to join us in these meetings though, but we know we'll be working all together if something or when something happens here in our community.
Oh.
So again, thank you for joining us today. Have a good day the rest of the day, and we'll see you at our next meeting. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.